right. Now, let's go back to the opening words of chapter 1, and I want to point out a couple of things there that I haven't done yet. And this is in his opening words, his salutation. We've seen the structure. But look at what he says. Paul, a bond servant of Jesus Christ. Remember we saw the word bond servant in Philippians, both of Paul and Timothy in verse 1, and then of Christ in chapter 2. Remember that? So I made a big emphasis of the word, the bond servant. Remember what that Greek word is? Doulos. D-O-U-L-O-S. Now he says of himself that he's called to be an apostle. And Paul was not an apostle in the original 12, minus 1 plus 1. And so when he calls himself an apostle, he's using the term in the narrow sense that despite the fact he was not one who followed Jesus day by day in his ministry, despite the fact he was not one who had observed the miracles of Jesus, despite the fact he was not present at the crucifixion, nor a witness in the first round of the resurrection of Jesus, nonetheless, as one born out of time, to use his phrase, God declared him to be an apostle and gave him revelation of the teaching and the miracles and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And those were all done one-on-one. And there's a sense in which God brought him up to date, and he did it really, really well. So the word apostle is used in two ways in the New Testament. It's used in the narrow, restrictive sense of the apostles, which is the 12, minus Judas, plus Matthias, plus number 13, Paul, right? Then the second way the word apostle is used is from its etymology, one who is sent. That's what apostolos means, one who is sent. And from that, we get the idea of a missionary. But the missionary is not someone in this word who says, you know, I've been thinking about things, and there's a town a few Roman miles away from here that I've never been to. It'd be fun to go there and do some shopping and check out the surf. It's on the coast. And I'll talk about Jesus. See? Now, that person can do wonderful work, but you wouldn't use the word apostle for that person, probably. The word apostle, in the broad sense, is still used with the idea of a person who is deliberately sent by an organized body of believers, by the church, on a mission with responsibility and the expectation of returning with a report. So I look at missionaries today who are under a ministry board. Now that could be one local church. For example, in our area, Denton Bible Church has become a congregation that raises up and trains and designates and prays for and supports their own missionaries. And they go out as missionaries from that very congregation. When I was in Singapore just a couple of weeks ago, I met a student who sat in this very room a year ago. His name is Matt Hilliard, and he is a missionary to Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, from the congregation in Denton. But I would say he's an apostle in the biblical sense of the word, that he's a missionary under official leadership and with direction and with encouragement and with support, and he's responsible to come back and tell them what's happening. And these days with email, you can do that as well, right? Now, you could also be a missionary under any number of mission boards, as you think about all the mission sending agencies today, from denominational ones like mine, CBI, Conservative Baptist International, to interdenominational groups like TEAM and SEND International, and to what we have today that is so wonderful, international sending groups where there are groups in India who are sending missionaries to other Asian countries and are doing it in conjunction with missionaries in other nations as well. So the word apostle in the broad sense is used of someone with a specific mission, and the idea of a distance or another culture or another setting is involved because one is sent. And that seems to be distinct from talking to your neighbors about Jesus. So is there a question about that? The word apostle, it's a term that's been debated a long time, so I've tried to give you two different meanings of the word. Okay? All right, so he's an apostle called by God.
Apostle, when I think about it, like, so there's kind of known as the apostolic gifts as far as miracles and things along that nature. Kind of biblically, where would you see? I know some people believe ceased or still continuing, and
Yes.
you know, the apostolic gifts and appointing elders and stuff like
Sure.
that. Kind of what would you say to that?
Well, my view is the standard view in these circles, that the sign gifts were important and appropriate and significant in that first generation to establish the credentials of the leaders of the new entity called the church, but that those petered out, and we're not looking for miracles today as credentials of apostles. At the same time, and listen to the rest of the sentence, God is still one who does wonders. And God may do wonders through any number of people, and including in the lives of missionaries. But I don't see that as a defining issue as it was. Right. All right, now, so far so good. Now, the big issue in this passage is the troubling words of verse 4. Declared to be the Son of God. Excuse me. Do you see the phrase in verse 4? This is about Jesus. Paul says he was declared to be the Son of God. That phrase has caused a great deal of difficulty because those who, in the history of the church and on to this very day, who do not believe or did not believe in the full deity of Christ, they've seized on this phrase. And this was the idea of Arius, A-R-I-A-S, who was opposed by Athanasius, the Orthodox scholar and defender of the Trinity. The idea here is there was a very good and godly man in a small village in what the Romans would call Palestina, and God looked down and he thought, there's a really good one. So he declared him to be son, and it isn't that Jesus was incarnate, it's that he was a man God chose who became God. So that's a view that is held by some even today. And they base it on this phrase. So Orthodox scholars have wondered, how can we deal with the Greek word, which I believe rightly is declared, and still hold on to our view of the eternality of the second member of the Trinity. Okay? So this is a real theological problem. So let me give you my answer to this, and it's based on the Psalms, and we've already been there. Look at verse 3. It says, well, actually I should read the full sentence. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God, so there's the word gospel, which he promised beforehand through the prophets and the Holy Scriptures. And we've been there before. I've emphasized that Paul argues that the gospel is in Hebrew Bible, and by that he means the prophecies of the death of Jesus for sinners and the resurrection of the Messiah on the third day. And we have talked about that from 1 Corinthians 15. And this is actually reiterating what we have in 1 Corinthians 15. And then he says, verse 3, concerning his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Now just pause there. In that phrase, concerning his Son, that's the eternal deity of Christ. His Son, the Father's Son, This is the metaphor that the writers of the Bible choose to use. You know that God is spirit, and so God is not male nor female. It's beyond all that. God is spirit. But the language that the writers of the Bibles choose to use is masculine terminology. So we call God the Father, all right? Now then, in eternity, there's a second person of the Trinity who is called the Son. And the reason he's called the Son is because of the incarnation. And in the incarnation, it was not a little girl that was born in the body, from the body of Mary, but it was a baby boy. So he's the Son. So it says, concerning his Son, that's eternal, whose human name is Yeshua, Jesus, and whose title is Christos, or better, Mashiach. By the way, I know you know this, but you need to tell everybody else this when you teach a Bible class. You need to just remind people, and do it in fun so they don't get embarrassed, that Christ was not Jesus' last name. So it wasn't that there was Jesus Christ and Sally Christ and Billy Christ, all the little Christ family, and, have fun with it, but make people realize that Christ is not his name, it's his title. And the title, Christ, is Messiah. Again, the Hebrew word is Mashiach, and we say in English Messiah, but the Greek rendering is Christos, and it's the same word, the anointed one. And then it says, our Lord. And the word Lord, of course, speaks of his sovereignty and the fact that he is in control. So these are wonderful words. Peritu huiu, autu, atu, genamenu. These words describe really powerful ideas. But then it says, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh. Now what's that talking about? His incarnation. And look at the phrase seed of David. Do you see that? Seed of David? That puts us immediately into the Davidic covenant. And even premillenarian scholars on our campus are troubled by the phrase declared to be the Son of God, but they shouldn't be, because they should see the phrase born of the seed of David. This has to do with the Davidic covenant. So when it says declared to be the Son of God with power according to the resurrection from the dead, what this means is, as Jesus in his mortal life was declared to be the Son of God in the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant at the time of his baptism, you hear that? So by virtue of the resurrection is declared again to be the Son of God in the sense of the Davidic covenant. So Jesus is Son of God in two powerful ways. He is the eternal Son of God, forever blessed with Spirit and Father in the Trinity. That's one, and that's verse 3. But he did become the Son of God in the sense of the Davidic covenant, as every descendant from David who was anointed king by prophetic sanction and priestly ritual, and has the words, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." We just saw those words in Hebrews chapter 1, and they take us back to Psalm 2 and 2 Samuel 7. So we've already been there. And the theology of Psalm 2 now comes parading across the page of Romans chapter 1. And this is no longer a problematic phrase. It's a phrase in which we may exult. Are you with me on this? He is the Son of God forever, but he has become the Son of God in the fact that he is the heir of the Davidic covenant. He was made that at his baptism, but on his death, it appeared to have come to an end. But because he was resurrected, in the glory of his resurrection, done by the power of the Spirit of holiness, he has now been declared again to be his own successor. That's why Jesus, I mentioned when we were Psalm 2, could not have married or fathered children. It would have muddied everything up. It's not that marriage is wrong. It's not that having children is wrong. It's that if Jesus had children, especially if he had a son, it would ruin the whole analogy. And the analogy is, he is the descendant of David who is declared to be Son of God as King, who will reign forever. And the way he can reign forever is by virtue of his resurrection and the fact that he lives forever, and one day gloriously will be on the throne of David in Jerusalem, as countless passages such as Isaiah 9 declare. And Isaiah 9, by the way, ends with the oath of God, lest we begin to think these things aren't true. And Isaiah 9, that great section ends, the zeal of Yahweh of hosts will do this. All right, well, let's turn now to the book of Romans, will you? And we've been, in the beginning of the book, we've seen the words of introduction and the greetings, and we had a principal focus on the verses 16 and 17, which the book is modeled after. Spent a lot of time on that. Now we start with verse 18, chapter 118, and that first major unit of the book goes from 118 to 320. And that's extremely important. We know where the divisions are. And in that major section, chapters 118 to 320, there is the statement that righteousness is needed because there is no righteousness apart from God's great gift. There's no righteousness among Jewish people. There's no righteousness among the Gentiles. Apart from God's gift, there simply is not the righteousness that he demands and expects, and over which his blessing will be seen. And this section begins with the awful word wrath. There's no getting around it. Now, that is an awful word. The wrath of God is even more awful. The word wrath is a word that you know in transliteration because the words have come from it. It's orge, O-R-G-E, with a line over the E. And from that comes the idea of agony, comes the idea of something that's just truly awful. And the wrath of God is the worst thing of all. Now, here's something that's really stunning. Whenever I'm asked to preach in a church, and I preach from the Old Testament, which I usually do, there are always people who come up after the service and they'll say, as they did yesterday when I was preaching in a church in Austin, "Oh, I didn't know that there was such a wonderful emphasis on the grace of God in the Old Testament." And I want to pop them, but I don't. I smile and I say, "Well, what did you think?" "Well, I thought the Old Testament's about wrath and the New Testament is about grace." Well, now look at this, folks. This is Romans in the New Testament, and we have 3 chapters that are overwhelmingly dominated by the word wrath. Because wrath is not an Old Testament issue any more than grace is a New Testament concept. Both wrath and grace describe God, and God is unchanging. Therefore, the record of wrath and mercy is found in both Testaments, and this is a studied presentation of the wrath of God. Now, when you read the chapter, you find an emphasis on homosexuality. And this is something that we can push too much, or we can back up from and not present strongly enough. Did you know, for example, that according to the broadcast laws of the country of Canada, that if a Christian broadcaster is to say something negative about homosexuality, the station can lose its license and he can be fined or even imprisoned because of the reaction against homophobia, the idea that someone could speak negatively or critically about homosexuality has become, in some parts of the world, a matter of illegality, which is hard to believe, isn't it? How our culture has changed. In this passage, there is a studied focus on homosexuality. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. It is not because homosexuality is the worst of sins. It is because, I believe, Paul, when he wrote this book, was in Corinth. And in fact, he'd been in Corinth for a number of months. He may have had 3 months in Corinth when he wrote the letter in AD 57. And in Corinth, not only did he find a flourishing church and wonderful people and hosts and gracious place to live, and his needs were met admirably, but he also was living in a city that was filled with immorality, flagrant immorality, and to him, almost unbelievable immorality. There was the whole line of temples side by side, and he talks about the meat issue, which we've talked about earlier. The cheapest place to buy fresh meat, I told you, was behind the temples. But what I didn't tell you about those temples is that there were houses of prostitution, bordellos, and official sanctioned cult prostitutes, both men and women, that were associated with those temples. And flagrant homosexual, heterosexual misbehavior was to be seen on every step. It's sort of like seeing Starbucks today on nearly every corner. On nearly every corner in Corinth, there was yet another house of ill repute, either quasi-religious or not. When you come to Corinth, as we did just a few weeks ago on our recent trip, they show you, the guide shows you a marking on the cement where there's human foot, and then there's a graffito. By the way, did you know that? Graffiti is plural, and see, being the consummate grammarian, this is a graffito. A singular, isn't that good? You can amaze all your friends with that. Of course, if you do it too much, you won't have any friends left to amaze. But there is a graffito with this foot telling you where the nearest bordello is, and this was right near the port. And it's a port city, and sailors getting leave, they don't want to waste any time. So where can they get a bottle of wine, and where can they hook up with a prostitute? And that's what the city was known for. In fact, throughout the Roman world, the name of the city was turned into a verb. And the verb was to Corinthianize. And to Corinthianize means to act in an almost bestial manner of misbehavior and sexual things. There is a museum at Corinth that I have visited before, but when I visited before, I didn't know to ask about the locked room. And my friend H. Wayne House, who is the New Testament editor of our study Bible, he said, Ron, the next time you go to Corinth, if you have children with you, have someone take the children to another area of the museum, and then tell the adults that if you want to see something very unusual and very disgusting, follow me. If you'd rather not, go with the children. And so this time we went to the locked room. And I think seeing the locked room explains a phrase that is so important in this passage on homosexuality. It says in verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions, ... It says, receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which is due. Did you see that? Receiving in themselves the penalty of their error that is due. So this time we went into the locked room. I looked at Bev and we made a deal. You know I take pictures. I took a bunch of pictures and then I promised Bev I will not show them at Dallas Seminary. That was the deal. I have the pictures for reference, but I'm not going to show them. But I'll tell you just in a couple of sentences what the pictures were. They were anatomical models made of clay of deformed sexual organs, the results of many kinds of sexually transmitted diseases. And the doctors in Corinth had to treat so many types of disease and the horrible malformations that came from some of these diseases, and it was so commonplace that they actually had models. If you see this, then this is the treatment to use. And if you see that, then you do this kind of surgery. So can you imagine a city in which sexual immorality was so awful that the specialists there had to have special training in order to deal with what happened to people's bodies? It was absolutely awful. And Paul, raised in a Orthodox Jewish home and raised in Torah, when he saw what was happening in Corinth, it must have just caused him stomach revulsion and mental revulsion as well. And that's probably why he focuses upon this as he does. But having said that, it's really important that we do not overplay it, because homosexuality in this passage is example A of any number of sins that provoke the wrath of God. So it's not just the sinful behavior and sexual misfunction, but look at what else it is: envy and murder and strife and deceit and whispering and backbiting and boasting and being disobedient to parents and being unloving and unmerciful. That is, he has a whole list of besetting sins, but he's picked on one because in the city where he was writing, it was an overwhelmingly prominent issue. And what he saw in Corinth was also to be seen in Rome. Now, having said that, let me tell you what the homosexual party tries to do with this passage. Now, you know, we have, this room doesn't have the word exit. In most rooms, you have over a door the word exit. And ex means out. And we have exegesis. And exegesis means to read out the meaning of a passage. I've mentioned this before. We have eisegesis. That's the accidental, the non-planned reading into a passage, what really isn't there, but you just are reading it from your own culture, and you don't know that you're reading something in. You just assume things were the same as they are in your place, whatever that place might be. An example of eisegesis was the decision to call Jesus a carpenter. Did you hear that? The Greek word in the New Testament is tekton, and that means a skilled laborer of some sort. And people who lived in forested lands thought, well, he was probably a carpenter. And Martin Luther, who lived in Germany, that was good for him. And the translators of the English Bible, that was certainly good for them, because they all lived in forested lands. But when you go to Israel, you see there are no forests. And the forests that were in the Old Testament period were good for wood for fire, but not for much else, and certainly not for building. And yet all the building that was done of stone. So we now believe that Jesus and his father, assumed father, and his brothers were all stonemasons, and that they worked in the city of Sepphoris as day laborers. And that's why Jesus knows so much about what a day laborer would earn and how a day laborer's workday would go. So we think that he was a stonemason. Well, that was eisegesis. And it was not a deliberate mistake. It's just trying to figure things out from your own perspective. So there's exegesis, what we're supposed to do, reading out the message of the Bible. Eisegesis is reading into the Bible accidentally. But then Ben Patterson, a pastor in California, wrote an article in Leadership magazine a number of years ago, and he said, you know, there's another thing today meta-Jesus, M-E-T-A, like metamorphosis. Meta has to do with change. And there are people, he said, today who deliberately change the meaning of the Bible because they don't like what it says. And that is a true evil. Exegesis is what we're supposed to do. Eisegesis is something we all do some of, but when we learn about it, we want to get away from it. But metagesis is the deliberate perversion of the message of the Bible because we don't like it and we want it to say something else. So I went one time to a full Saturday seminar put on by the Gay and Lesbian Evangelical Alliance of Denver, Colorado. Did you hear that? The Gay and Lesbian Evangelical Alliance. And they had Christians, they said, who wanted to explain Bible passages from a new perspective. And I was very interested to what they'd say about Romans 1. And this was their interpretation. Their interpretation focused on the word natural and unnatural. And they had a premise. Since my homosexuality, one speaker said, is natural, what this passage is about is not me. When I engage in sexual relations with a man as a man, that's the way God created me, that is natural for me. And what Paul was talking about is the sin that comes when a heterosexual man tries to pretend that he's homosexual. Or, more commonly, when a homosexual man tries to live as a heterosexual. And in that case, they're going against the nature that God gave them, and that's what this passage is about, no more and no less. Now, that's metagesis, pure and simple. That's saying, I really don't like what this passage says, so I'm going to change it so it fits what I like. Are you with me on that? So this passage does speak strongly against homosexual behavior. And to say it doesn't, even if the communication standards of an entire country say you cannot say this, it's still true. This passage speaks against the evil of homosexual behavior. But it doesn't say that homosexuality is the worst of sins. It's just a sin that Paul found himself benumbed about because of where he was when he wrote this book, and it's sort of exhibit A of the sinfulness of man. Natural revelation comes in verses 19 and 20. So just a little bit about that. This is a major topic, by the way, in theology, natural revelation, and this is the idea of natural revelation. God has made known in creation enough of His person that people are without excuse if they worship the created thing rather than the creator of the things. Now, this fits in with a long line of biblical teaching. It's not new in Romans 1. One of the great places we read about this is in Psalm 19, where the heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows His handiwork. And the idea is that if a person were not beset with sin, then looking at a star-filled night, holding a baby for the first time, looking at the poppies on the side of the road as I did Saturday. Do you know what I did Saturday? Oh, this is really exciting to me. It's not to you, but it is to me. I did my first organized bike ride since my surgery. And for 3.5 years, I've been off the bike, but my doctor said I can get back on. So in Georgetown, Texas, I was on what they're calling the first annual Saratoma, that's a service club, Red Poppy Ride for Scholarships. And there were several hundred people And it was a wonderful day. And the red poppies were everywhere, these wonderful wildflowers. Anyway, seeing the red poppies in the wind. Oh, by the way, when you're riding a bicycle into the wind, that's tough. And there was a heavy wind, and we kind of went like this, but the wind was always at our face. And I didn't ride that far, but it seemed like I rode twice the distance just because of that heavy wind. And then when we made the turn to come back to the starting point, it was a big loop, all of a sudden the wind stopped. It just stopped. And I had this roar in my ears for the whole morning, and all of a sudden there was no roar. But then I looked, and the grass was still flat from the wind. The trees were still bowed from the wind, and a flag was being ripped by the wind. And what had happened is we turned, and now we were riding with the wind at the speed of the wind, 17 miles an hour. And so the wind had ceased to blow for us. Isn't that something? It was just an amazing feeling. Well, anyway, to see those red poppies, to see a brilliant starlit night, to hold a baby for the first time, those are things that are supposed to drive you to awe of the Creator. But unfortunately, throughout time, most people in most places have worshiped created things rather than the Creator of themselves and all things. But what this passage doesn't tell us is that there are some exceptions. And let me tell you of one of them. You know his name from the Old Testament. Maybe you haven't thought about it in this line. Melchizedek, Genesis 14. Melchizedek, he was a man who, when Abraham met him, Abraham was then Avram, when Abraham met him, Abraham recognized him to be a true priest of true God. And the words that Melchizedek used to bless true God is he is the Most High, Elyon, and he talks about heaven and earth. And what he had come to the conclusion concerning is that creation is not to be worshipped, but the God who made it is the one to be worshipped. So Melchizedek is an example of someone who came to faith in God apart from being related to the Hebrew people. Actually, the Hebrew people weren't even around yet. It's just Avram, and this is before Isaac is born, and Abraham recognized him to be a true believer in true God. And he is an example of what can happen, but hardly ever does. Okay? All right. Now, let's move to chapter 2. We're moving rapidly. We must. You're inexcusable, O man, whoever you are. And this has to do with God's judgment is righteous because whether one is Greek or Jewish, they're all without excuse before God because they're all under wrath, because they're all in sin. So you're inexcusable, O man, whoever you are. And that sort of sets the stage for that whole section going down through verse 16. And verse 12, as many have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. And as many have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. So that Gentile people who do not know God and Jewish people who've not come to true and genuine saving faith in God are equally under the same judgment, and it's a judgment that leaves them without excuse. The idea is this: God has revealed enough of himself in creation that a person has the evidence to come to faith in the Creator God. Now, that person is not going to know all there's to know about God from the revelation of creation, certainly not. But what one can know, in verse 20 of chapter 1 says, the invisible attributes of God. What can know is his eternal power and Godhead, his essential deity. And is it possible that there have been through time people groups like Melchizedek? Well, I'd like to hope so, but we don't know of them. Some have said that there are pockets of Chinese people through time who came to an idea of the one great almighty God and worshiped him as true God, and I'd love to believe that. I just don't know enough to know how true that is. Sometimes we hear that African tribal peoples hundreds of years ago sometimes may have turned from idolatry and turned to the worship of a true, great Creator God. We'd like to believe that, just out of human charity. We'd like to believe that. But the thing is, we don't know much about it, whether those things are true or not. But what we do know is that the overwhelming mass of humanity is in judgment because they've turned from the revelation of creation to worshiping created things. And because of that, they're in wrath. And there's a hardness of heart, verse 5, and there are the actions of wickedness that are treasured up, and there are people who are self-seeking and do not obey truth, but obey unrighteousness and indignation and wrath and tribulation and anguish. And this is a litany of evil. I mean, it's so bad you'd think it's written by an Old Testament prophet. I thought that stuff is in Hebrew Bible. And it is, but it's also here. And what it's saying is that all people are under judgment.